What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Primetime Sports Podcast, hosted by Joe Larry. So in this episode, it's going to be a big rant about the College World Series bracket that just came out this past Sunday. I'm going to give a breakdown of the last four teams that got in. I'll talk about some bubble teams that got in, and then I'll mention some teams that I thought should have gotten into the bracket. I'm not going to give a breakdown of the entire bracket in this episode. The bracket does start on Friday. I'll probably have something then quickly. I do have a busy week, but I'll probably have some sort of episode out on Friday for my predictions. But this episode is just going to be a big rant about the last four teams that got in and talk about the bubble teams that got into the tournament that I thought shouldn't have gotten in. We'll talk about the last four that got in. Let's start there. James Madison, Central Florida, Indiana, and Coastal Carolina were the last four teams into the NCAA baseball tournament. Two of them have ADs on the committee. So I do think there's some sort of collusion going on, and the NCAA definitely needs to find a different way to choose which teams make it into the tournament. I don't think Coastal Carolina should have gotten in. They do have an AD on the committee as a chairman, so it definitely helps having that be the case. And then Kansas State, I don't think should have gotten in either, but they also do have an AD on the committee. Florida got in, Indiana got in. All four of those teams I just mentioned, Kansas State, Florida, Indiana, and Coastal Carolina, all were bubble teams that made it into the tournament, and they all have ADs on the committee. And I do understand there's going to be bubble teams that make it in, and there's going to be bubble teams that miss. That happens every single year in each and every NCAA tournament. I get that at the end of the day, but I do think the way the NCAA baseball committee goes about it, I don't think it's the best formula. And I know Matt Hogue talked on ESPN. He's a chairman on the committee. He's also the AD at Coastal Carolina. He did talk to ESPN about the question of ethical decision-making on the committee, and he tried to say they're unbiased, but I still feel like there's something going on behind the scenes. And here's a clip of him talking to ESPN on Sunday.
Challenges of having a committee with so many people that have a vested interest in the outcome.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question, Matt. We have a very strict safety net procedure within the NCAA's protocols and rules. If any schools are discussed that have committee members representing them, they have to leave the room. They can't be a part of the discussion. They also cannot be a part of the voting procedure. So there are recusal protocols in place and other protocols to keep that fair and balanced.
So that was Matt Hogue, the athletic director at Coastal Carolina, a team that was on the bubble that ended up making it into the tournament as a Final Four team in. And I think at the end of the day, I do think there's something going on behind the scenes. Even if the athletic director of a school that is on the bubble of making it into the tournament, let's say they do leave the room, what happens if he has friends on the committee that will vote his team in? Let's say when Coastal Carolina is getting voted on, Hogue leaves the room. What happens if, let's say, Indiana's athletic director ends up saying, I'll vote for you if you vote for me? Who knows? And I know that's a conspiracy theory to some degree. I know people probably aren't going to agree with that. But I do think there's something going on behind the scenes. And Teddy Cahill of Baseball America said this in an article. He said the committee is composed of sitting college baseball administrators. This year, it's 10 athletic directors. And unluckily, this year, a lot of those committee members had teams that fell on the bubble of something. The top 8 seeds, hosting, or making it into the tournament field. And just about every decision that involved one of those schools went in a favorable direction for those teams. And that's a quote there from Teddy Cahill of Baseball America. And I agree with them. The fact that a lot of those teams had athletic directors representing them, and they ended up falling in the bubble of something, and they ended up getting their way, whether it's making it into the tournament, whether it's being a host team, whether it's being a top 8 seed, a lot of them having the decisions go their way just makes it seem like there's something going on behind the scenes. As Teddy Cahill pointed out, it went in favorable direction for each of those schools. Kansas State, Coastal Carolina, they both have athletic directors on the committee. Florida, Indiana, they were both bubble teams as well. Indiana was the last 4 team in, same with Coastal Carolina. Florida and Kansas State made it in without being the last 4 in, but they were bubble teams as well, and they have ADs on the committee. So it's pretty crazy that a lot of these teams with committee members that are athletic directors at those schools had decisions go their way. And like I said, who knows if Coastal Carolina's athletic director, Matt Hogue, says to the Indiana AD, I'll vote for you if you vote for me. And the same could go for Kansas State. And the same could go for Indiana. I do find it pretty interesting, though, that 4 bubble teams, Kansas State, Florida, Indiana, Coastal Carolina, they have 4 athletic directors on the committee. Of the 10 athletic directors that are chairman, that are voting on these teams getting in and not getting in, and all 4 of those teams had the decision go in their favor. It's pretty interesting to me. So now I'm going to give a look into some bubble teams that made it into the tournament. We'll start off with UConn. I don't think they should have been as easy of an in in my opinion. I think, maybe they should have gotten in, but I don't think they should have gotten in as easily. I think they should have probably have been a last four in. Then UCF, James Madison. I love how fired up those players were. It seems like they didn't expect to get in. I do love the energy they brought. I still don't think they should have made it into the tournament, though. Then Georgia Tech, West Virginia, Coastal Carolina, Kansas State, Oregon, Florida, Indiana. All of those teams are bubble teams that got in. Like I noted already, there are going to be bubble teams that make it in. There are going to be bubble teams that miss. I know that's just the way that these tournaments are picked. But it seems like a lot of these bubble teams got their way because they had ADs on the committee. Like Kansas State, like Indiana, like Coastal Carolina, like Florida. And it also seems like the SEC got their way. 11 teams made it in, which is the most for a single conference in the NCAA baseball tournament ever. And it seems like the SEC always gets their way, whether it's the college football playoff, whether it's the NCAA baseball tournament. It seems like they do get their way a lot of the time. But there are some teams that I don't think should have gotten in, including an SEC team. Florida, I don't think they should have gotten in. I think they got in, yes, because they were number one in strength of schedule, which is something the committee was saying that they really valued the season. But Florida did have a losing record in Quadrant 1. They had a losing record in Quadrant 2. And they also had a losing record in Quadrant 3 games. I think the NCAA just wanted to see Jack Caglione get into the tournament because obviously being a pitcher and a hitter, it definitely does grow the game. So I think the NCAA wanted to give him another chance to grow the interest of the tournament. And then Indiana got in, James Madison got in, Kansas State got in. I don't know if I agree with any of those teams getting in, which I'll give a look more into those bubble teams that got in just a minute. Now I'm going to transition and talk about bubble teams that deserve to get in. I think Northeastern, they're the biggest snub of the tournament. And I know I'm a Northeastern fan. I know it's going to sound biased, but I'm going to give a look into how Northeastern performed this season, give a breakdown of some of their bigger games, and make a case for why they should have gotten into this tournament. The Northeastern Huskies were the highest ranked team in the RPI rankings that did not make it into the tournament. And that's besides Ole Miss, but they were under 500 for a record, though. You're not really going to put too many teams in with an under 500 record, if ever, so it makes sense Ole Miss missed out. But Northeastern was the highest ranked RPI team in the rankings that didn't make it in besides Ole Miss. Northeastern was 4-4 in Quadrant 1 games, 8-5 in Quadrant 2 games, so they were 12-9 in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2 combined. They were 9-7 in Quadrant 3, which they definitely need to be better in Quadrant 3. I get it. They did lose some games they should have won. Losing to Hofstra, losing to William & Mary in the first two games of the CAA tournament definitely did not help their case. Those two games, they did hold 2-run leads in early on, but they did end up losing. But keep in mind, Northeastern was a top 25 team before the season began. So they had high expectations, and I get being 9-7 in Quadrant 3 isn't the best record. But if you look at their schedule, they played in a lot of big games against a lot of good teams. They were 1-2 against Arizona, who was a regional host. Arizona was 31st in the RPI rankings. Northeastern was 35th, I believe. Northeastern ends up not making it in, but the team that's 31st in the RPI rankings ends up hosting a regional, and that's Arizona. So it just proves that this committee did not value the RPI at all. So what's the point of the RPI then? What's the point of even looking at it if it's not being valued? Northeastern was 2-0 against UConn, including an 18-3 win. UConn ends up making it in rather easily into the tournament. Northeastern had a 1-run loss in extra innings at home to Kansas State, who made it into the tournament, which, like I noted, Kansas State does have an AD on the committee, so I do think that helped them get into the tournament. That definitely played in their favor, but Northeastern did lose to them by 1. Northeastern was 1-2 against UNCW, who made it into the tournament as an automatic qualifier. They had a 7-0 win over Georgia Tech, who was a bubble team, in my opinion, that made it in. And they also beat Bryant, who was an automatic qualifier that made it into the tournament. Northeastern beat them 5-4 this season. So they had a lot of games against teams that made it into the tournament. 1-2 versus Arizona, 2-0 versus UConn, 1-2 versus UNCW, 0-1 in a 1-run loss in extra innings to Kansas State, a 7-0 win on the road at Georgia Tech, and then a 5-4 win over Bryant. Northeastern did lose 2 of 3 games at one point to North Carolina A&T, which definitely didn't help. That definitely hurt their case. I get it. Northeastern could have done more at certain times of the season, but to be 12-9 in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2 games with multiple wins over bubble teams that made it into the tournament is definitely tough to see. Especially when you look at it, Northeastern was 35th in the RPI rankings with a lot of teams below them that were bubble teams that made it into the tournament. So that's obviously tough to see. I think they were overlooked. Not even being a last 4 in or a first 4 out is pretty crazy to me for Northeastern. I think they deserve to be in this tournament. And the reality is, Northeastern needed an athletic director on the committee to get in. And it sounds sarcastic, and I get it. It is being sarcastic. But at the same time, it's true. The reality is that if Northeastern had an athletic director on the committee, they probably would have made it in. The same goes for Charleston. The same goes for TCU. The same goes for Cincinnati. The NCAA needs to find a way to change their selection committee. You need to get unbiased parties to choose who's making it into the tournament and who's not making it into the tournament. You can't have guys that are on the committee that are athletic directors at the school that are on the bubble and have them voting on other bubble teams to make it in. Yes, Matt Hogue might have left the room when Coastal Carolina was getting voted upon, but how do we know he didn't have friends on the committee that were vouching for him just like he was going to do the same for them when their school was getting picked upon? I definitely think that might happen. I really do think there are teams that are vouching for other teams, saying if you vote for me, I'll vote for you type of thing. Which, obviously, there's a lot probably going on behind the scenes that we don't know about, but that's just the case I get. I don't think having biased parties choosing makes much sense. You should have unbiased parties choosing who makes it in and who doesn't make it in from the selection committee. Northeastern did have a strength of schedule at 108th, which I know is something that they talked a lot about, that they valued this year with strength of schedule. But a non-conference strength of schedule, Northeastern was 64th, with a non-conference RPI of 13th. They had some big wins over some good teams. 2 over UConn, 1 win in 3 games over Arizona, a win over Bryant, a 1-run loss over Kansas State. They had some good wins over some good teams. A 7-0 win over Georgia Tech, who I thought should have been more of a bubble team. Them making it in so easily, I thought really didn't make too much sense. But at the end of the day, I think Northeastern should have gotten in. I think they were the biggest snub of this tournament. I think Mike Lavin and the Huskies deserved better. I really do. Another team that should have gotten in was UCal, Cal Berkeley. They won 20 of their last 25 games, sweeping Oregon State and also beating Arizona in the Pac-12 tournament. And UConn was really hot to end the season. I think that was something that probably played in their favor for why they got in. But Cal won 20 of their last 25 games. And they also swept UConn 3 of 3 times. And they also beat Kansas State once. So I think Cal Berkeley deserved to get in. They swept UConn 3 of 3 times, and they also beat Kansas State. They were 64th in the RPI, which is pretty low, but they were 5-2 in Quadrant 1 games and 8-9 in Quadrant 2 games. 13-11 in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2 games. Mind you, they also did sweep Oregon State in 3 of 3 games this season. They took 3 of 3 versus UConn, and they also took 1 of 3 games against Oregon, another team that made it into the tournament. So I think Cal Berkeley should have gotten in. TCU, another team that probably could have gotten in. They had a higher RPI and a higher KPI than Indiana and James Madison. They were 3-1 versus Kansas State. They had a top 15 non-conference strength of schedule, and they were also top 10 before the season began. But the issue is, they didn't have an AD on the committee. They also didn't really help themselves in Quadrant 1 games. They were 5-8 in Quadrant 1 games. They were 8-9 in Quadrant 2 games. They were also 3-5 in their last 8 games. So if they played a little bit better at the end of the season, maybe they could have gotten in. But I do think they deserved a little bit more of a look to get into the tournament. Another team that deserved a little bit more of a look, Lamar. Lamar was 44-15 overall. They were 3-1 in Quadrant 1 games. They swept Oklahoma in a 3-game set on the road in March. They had a great pitching staff, 3.79 team ERA, the 3rd best in college baseball. They were 60th in the RPI rankings, which a big issue for them is strength of schedule. They were 205th in strength of schedule because the conference obviously isn't that strong. And they were 257th in non-conference strength of schedule, so they probably could have made it a little bit harder on themselves in non-conference play. So that obviously didn't play in their favor, but I do think Northeastern deserved to get in because of the teams they had to play against in the non-conference games. They did challenge themselves. Another team that was a bubble team that didn't make it in was the College of Charleston. They won 26 of their last 31 games. They won the CAA regular season title, and they also lost in the CAA tournament final game. Yet they were snubbed from the tournament. And their head coach, Chad Holbrook, said, if you told me before this weekend that we had to win the tournament to get in, meaning the CAA tournament, I think that would be criminal. We won the regular season. In my view, you should be judged on the 3 months of the season, not the last 2 to 3 days. And I agree with them. It should be a holistic view. One thing that hurt Charleston was that they were just 3-4 in Quadrant 1 games, which hurts them. They were 6-6 in Quadrant 2 games. So just 9-10 overall in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2, which Northeastern had a better record than them in both of those categories. And their strength of schedule was 112, which hurts. And they also had a non-conference strength of schedule of 177. So I do think that didn't play in their favor. Like I noted, the committee did value strength of schedule this season. And that's why Florida made it in, because they had the number 1 strength of schedule. They had the hardest schedule in college baseball. But I'd say with Charleston, the best team they probably had to play against was probably UNCW or Nebraska. And they did sweep Nebraska 3 of 3, which was obviously huge. But even though they could have gotten in, they needed more challenging wins, in my opinion. They needed more challenging wins like Northeastern and TCU had. Charleston is still a snub, but I do think Northeastern and TCU are a little bit more of a snub. With that being said, Charleston did also have a series win over Northeastern and a series win over UNCW. And like I noted, they did win the CAA regular season title. But the committee didn't value the CAA this season. With just one bid being the automatic qualifier in UNCW, they didn't value the CAA this season. The committee just did not value the CAA. If you look at Charleston, their schedule also was pretty favorable early on in the season. They played their first 18 games all at home. So they should have challenged themselves a little bit more early on, which is why I get them missing out. As tough as it is to say, I do think they should have challenged themselves a little bit more. Northeastern had a toughest schedule. That's why I think they deserve to get in. They had a better record in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2. That's why I think Northeastern deserved to get in, and that's why I think Northeastern's the biggest snub. I think Northeastern and TCU and UCal Berkeley were the three biggest snubs. And I think Lamar and Charleston could have gotten in as well. Another team that could have gotten in was Cincinnati. They were 32-25 overall, and they had a better record in the Big 12 than UCF. UCF was 14-15 in the Big 12, 35-19 overall, but 14-15 in the Big 12. Cincinnati was 17-13 overall, and with 32-25 overall in the Big 12. One thing that hurt TCU is that they were just 14-16 overall in the Big 12. 14-16. But they were 33-21 overall. I do think they should have deserved a little bit better of a look to get into the tournament. With that being said, I know TCU and Northeastern could have done more in certain parts of the season. I know that, and I get that. But I do still think they were snubs. And I think Northeastern is the biggest snub of them all. Because I legitimately think they were better than a lot of those bubble teams that got in. All four of those bubble teams with ADs on the committee that successfully got into the tournament, I think Northeastern could have beaten any of those teams. Kansas State, Indiana, Coastal Carolina, Florida. All four of those bubble teams that got in had athletic directors on the committee, which, like I said, is something that the NCAA needs to look into. You need to have a better system for picking who gets into the tournament. And I don't think just adding teams just solves all of the issues. Because at the end of the day, no matter how many teams are in the tournament, whether it's 64 like it is right now, or there's 70 teams, which is a proposal that ESPN brought up, I still think there are teams that are going to miss out. There's always going to be bubble teams that make it and miss it. So I don't think just adding teams solves all of these issues. There will still be issues with teams getting in and not getting in on the bubble and off the bubble, with teams that, if this committee vote still stays the same, where there are chairmen that are athletic directors that are voting, I still think there could be the same situation in the future, where there are chairmen voting for other chairmen when there's a bubble vote, and then that chairman that just voted for Team B, when Team B goes and votes on Team A, they're going to vote for Team A to get in because Team A picked them already. So now I'm going to get a look into the bubble teams a little bit further. UConn was 3-9 to begin the season, so obviously a rough start, but they were 15-3 in their last 18 regular season games, so they are coming in hot into the tournament. But Charleston finished the regular season very hot, and also another team that finished the season very hot was California Berkeley, and neither one of those teams made it into the tournament. So I don't think UConn just finishing the regular season strong is a reason they should have gotten in as easily as they did. UConn was 10-17 in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2 games, with 5 of those wins coming against Georgetown and Xavier. They were 5-8 in Quadrant 1 and 5-9 in Quadrant 2. They were swept by UC Santa Barbara in 3 of 3 games. They lost to BC twice. BC did struggle this season. And they also lost to Northeastern twice. Losing 2 times to BC should have hurt them more in the RPI. But it seems like the RPI was just not valued as much this season, especially considering how many teams jumped Northeastern and TCU and Charleston in the selection show. UConn did finish the regular season on a high note, but the fact that they were not a last 4 team in is surprising in my eyes. If they're going to make it into the tournament, they should have been on the border a little bit more. They have been essentially a lock for the NCAA tournament over the last decade, but that shouldn't be a reason that they just get in. They should not have gone in as easily as they did, but obviously the 15-3 in the last 18 games definitely played a role in them getting in. But I don't think UConn should have made it into the tournament. Another team that made it in that was on the bubble was Coastal Carolina. They were top 25 team for the first half of the season, then had a rough stretch in the middle half of the season, losing 8 games in a row with losses to Creighton, Troy, and Southern Miss. They were 4-9 in Quadrant 1 play this season, 7-7 in Quadrant 2. They were 11-16 in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2 combined. Northeastern was 12-9 in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2. So I think Northeastern had the edge over them there. Coastal Carolina was 22nd in strength of schedule. They were third in non-conference strength of schedule, which was definitely a major factor in them getting in. So they did challenge themselves, and obviously that's something that's valued. They split in 2 games with Wake Forest, 1-1. They beat UNC once. They did lose 4 games versus Southern Miss, and also lost 3 or 4 games against Appalachian State, which I think that should have hurt them a little bit more in the rankings. But the fact that they have a guy in the committee definitely helped, and the fact that they did challenge themselves with the 22nd strength of schedule and 3rd in non-conference strength of schedule, I think that definitely played a role in them getting in. And I think it makes sense. Even though they did have an AD in the committee, I do think there's still things going on behind the scenes. They did challenge themselves with the 22nd strength of schedule. But they were 4-9 in Quadrant 1 games, 7-7 in Quadrant 2, 11-16 in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2 games. They didn't really have a great record. They didn't really put together too strong of a resume in those Quadrant 1 games for them to get in as easily as they did. And I know they were a last 4 team in, but with an AD on the committee, they were getting in no matter what, realistically. They were 16-15 in the Sun Belt overall, and like I noted, 4-9 in Quadrant 1 games. There are 10 ADs that are chairmen that are making these decisions, and Coastal Carolina had one that was a chairman on the committee. So they were probably getting in no matter what, realistically. Another team that was on the bubble that made it in was Kansas State. They were just 7-15 in Quadrant 1 games. They did have a 1-run win on the road in 11 innings over Northeastern, which probably did carry a little bit of weight since it was a Quadrant 1 win for them. But they really did struggle this season against TCU, losing 3 or 4. They lost to UCF. They lost to Oklahoma. They lost to Texas. They really struggled in all of those series. Kansas State was not good in any of those series against TCU, UCF, Oklahoma, and Texas. But they still made it in because they do have a chairman on the committee. I do think that played a role. I don't think Kansas State should have gotten into the tournament with a 7-15 record in Quadrant 1. Florida, they were 13-17 in the SEC, just 28-27 overall, 13-18 in Quadrant 1, 2-6 in Quadrant 2, for a combined 15-24 in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2 play combined. But their strength of schedule was the hottest in NCAA baseball. They won just 4 of their SEC series this season. They were swept by Missouri at one point, but I do think they got in because of Jack Caglione's ability to play as a pitcher and hit. That definitely adds buzz to the tournament because he can play both ways. And since Florida lost in the finals last season, and Caglione could be a top 3 to 5 pick, I think adding them into the tournament because of Caglione and them coming off a season where they made it into the finals in Omaha, I think that definitely played a role in them getting in because it could add buzz into the tournament, and I think the NCAA saw that. But also keep in mind, Florida does have an athletic director on the committee. They do. And like I've already noted now multiple times, I know Northeastern could have done more in the regular season. I know the same goes for TCU. I know the same goes for Cal Berkeley. They did hurt themselves at some points in the season, but that's just the reality. When you're playing 50, 60 games, you're going to have some down stretches during a season. A lot of the time, you're going to have down stretches when there's injuries or you run out of pitching. There's going to be down games during a 60-game season. That's just a reality. But I do think having an AD on the committee did play a role in some of these teams getting in, and Florida's just another one of them. Another one of those teams, Indiana. They also have an AD on the committee. Indiana was 6-10 in Quadrant 1 games. They were 6-4 in Quadrant 2 games. They were 55th in the RPI rankings, but 103rd in non-conference RPI. Northeastern was 4-4 in Quadrant 1 games, 12-9 in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2 combined, while Indiana was 12-14 in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2 combined. Indiana lost 2 of 3 games to Troy. They also did lose a game to Belmont. They also lost to Illinois State at one point, but I guess those losses didn't really hurt them. They were also 1-4 against Nebraska on the season. I don't think Indiana should have made it into the tournament. I really don't. And I don't think Kansas State should have made it into the tournament. Coastal Carolina did have a challenging schedule, so I guess with their record, making it into the tournament makes a little bit more sense in Kansas State and Indiana. And the same goes for Florida in that same category as Coastal Carolina. A tough schedule, so with their record and playing against all those tough teams, I guess it makes sense with them making it in. But for Indiana or Kansas State, I didn't really see it with them getting in. Georgia Tech also made it in. They were 49th in the RPI rankings, just 3-7 in the last 10 games. They were 6-5 in Quadrant 3 games. Northeastern was 9-7 in Quadrant 3 games, which supposedly hurt them, but it didn't hurt Georgia Tech. Also, Georgia Tech was swept by Boston College in 3 of 3 games this season, but that didn't hurt Georgia Tech either. Northeastern also beat Georgia Tech this season, 7-0 on the road at Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech did take 2 of 3 games against Duke at the end of the regular season, but the fact they made it in so easily and were not a Final Four team to me is a little bit crazy. They were 10-14 in Quadrant 1 games, which I know the ACC is a very tough conference to play baseball in, But they were 10-14 in Quadrant 1 games, Georgia Tech was. But the 10 wins makes sense with why they got in. With 10 wins, double-digit wins against Quadrant 1 teams, it makes a little bit more sense than it does for teams like Indiana and Kansas State making it in. At least that's my opinion. UCF also made it in. They were 33rd in the RPI, just 14-15 in the Big 12. 4-8 in Quadrant 1 games, 9-5 in Quadrant 2 games, which the Quadrant 2 record must have helped them because 4-8 in Quadrant 1 isn't really good at all. They couldn't really hold their weight in Quadrant 1 games. They were 42nd in strength of schedule, which I guess had to help. Supposedly strength of schedule, like I've noted, was something the committee really took seriously this season. UCF did take 4 or 5 games against Oklahoma State, which definitely helps them a ton. But they lost 3 of 3 against Oklahoma and also 3 of 3 against West Virginia. But the wins against Oklahoma State is a reason I'm okay with them getting in because they beat one of the best teams in the country 4 or 5 times. But I do think Northeastern is the better team than them. I do. James Madison also made it in. They were 5th in non-conference strength of schedule. So they did challenge themselves in the non-conference games. They were 7-8 in Quadrant 1 games, which is a little bit deceiving since 2 of those wins in Quadrant 1 were against East Tennessee State, and another 2 of those wins were against Troy, which both of those teams did have good seasons, Troy and East Tennessee State, but neither one made it into the tournament. So I don't really value those big wins in Quadrant 1 because Northeastern beat teams in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2 that made it into the tournament. But for James Madison, 4 of their wins in Quadrant 1 came against teams that missed out on the tournament. They were also 4-9 in Quadrant 2 games, James Madison. Just 4-9 in Quadrant 2. They were 11-17 in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2 games. Remember, Northeastern was 12-9 in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2, and they were 35th in the RPI, Northeastern. Northeastern was 35th in the RPI with a 12-9 record in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2. James Madison was 11-17, 11 wins, 17 losses in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2, and they were 44th in the RPI. Losing 3 of 4 games against Arkansas, losing 2 of 3 games against Coastal Carolina, but they still made it in. I don't think James Madison should have made it in my eyes. I don't. Oregon made it in. This is a team that I'm okay with making it in. And same goes for West Virginia. Oregon, they were a bubble team. They were 37-18 overall, 52 in the RPI, 5-4 in Quadrant 1, 6-4 in Quadrant 2, and 12-9 in Quadrant 3. They took 2 of 3 games against Arizona, took 2 of 4 against Oregon State, and they took 1 of 3 against Santa Barbara. Oregon making it in makes sense to me. They were 19-11 in a weaker Pac-12, but that's still a good record in their conference. And like I noted, some big wins against Arizona and Oregon State. West Virginia, another team that did challenge themselves and had some good wins this season. They were 5-8 in Quadrant 1. They were 13-8 in Quadrant 2. They took 2 of 3 games against Oklahoma, 3 of 3 against UCF, and 2 of 3 against Kansas State in the regular season. They also took 2 of 3 against TCU in the regular season. So West Virginia making it in makes sense to me because they beat some teams that made it into the tournament. Oklahoma, UCF, Kansas State. They beat some teams that made it into the tournament and had a decent record in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2 combined. 18-16 overall in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2. So I'm fine with Oregon and West Virginia making it in. But now I'm going to review which teams should not have gotten in. I don't think Kansas State should have made it in. I don't think Indiana should have made it in. And I'm iffy on Coastal Carolina. So 3 of the Final 4 teams that got in, I probably would have left out. I think UCF I'll give the benefit of the doubt to because of their 4 wins against Oklahoma State. But as for James Madison, I don't think they should have gotten in. I don't think Indiana should have gotten in. And Coastal Carolina, I'm iffy on. I'm iffy on Coastal Carolina. They did challenge themselves with a tough schedule, but they were just 4-9 in Quadrant 1 games. 4-9 in Quadrant 1 games. And also lost 4 games to Southern Miss and 3 of 4 against Appalachian State. They did split with Wake Forest, like I noted, but they were just 16-15 in the Sun Belt. I'm iffy on Coastal, but I don't think Kansas State and Indiana or James Madison should have gotten in. James Madison would have missed if it were up to me. They were 11-17 in Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2 games, with 4 of those wins coming against Troy, another team that just missed out on the tournament, and East Tennessee State. Florida, I'll give the benefit of the doubt to because of their hard schedule. Georgia Tech, they had 10 wins in Quadrant 1, which is why they got in, so I'm fine with them getting in, I guess, since they did win some games against some good teams. But going 3-7 in the last 10 games, I think should have hurt them a little more. They should have been a Final 4 team if they were a team that made it in, but they ended up making it in without being a Final 4 team. UCF, their 4 wins over Oklahoma State is a reason they got in. As I said, I guess I'm okay with that. And I'm fine with West Virginia and Oregon getting in. I think they did enough in some of their Quadrant 1 and Quadrant 2 games. But I still believe Northeastern was the biggest snub of the tournament. They're a better team than Kansas State, in my opinion. I think they're better than Coastal Carolina, and I think they're better than Indiana. I think Northeastern is better than UConn. I think they're better than James Madison. And I also think they're better than Georgia Tech. They beat Georgia Tech this season. Georgia Tech might be a tough team to play 3 times in a series, but they did beat them this season in their one game they played them. But I do think Northeastern's a better team than UConn, James Madison, Kansas State, Coastal Carolina, and Indiana. All 5 of those teams made it into the tournament. UConn going 15-3 in their last 18 games was probably why they got in. And I guess I'm okay with that since the hot teams usually get in. But Charleston was hot at the end of the regular season. The same goes to Cal Berkeley. Cal Berkeley was hot, and they didn't get in either. But UConn losing 2 of 2 times to BC and 2 of 2 times against Northeastern is why I think Northeastern should have gotten in over them. Northeastern was 4-0 against BC and also against UConn. 4-0. They beat both teams 2 times out of 2. And maybe I'm a little bit biased, and I admit that I'm a Northeastern fan, but I think Northeastern is a better team than UConn. The committee system just doesn't make sense to me. They use the RPI at some points of the season to rank some teams as a barometer for some of the rankings. And then when they get to the tournament, they just completely ignore Northeastern as a top 35 RPI team, while giving the 31st RPI team, Arizona, a regional host, which just proves they don't value the RPI at all. And maybe they need a different system to figure out who makes it into the tournament or not. Whether it's something like college hockey uses, like the pairwise rankings, or there's a legitimate committee that has unbiased parties voting on who gets in and who doesn't. Baseball America considered Northeastern a lock to get into the tournament. And if you look at the last 4 teams in and the first 4 teams out, 7 of 8 of those teams, Northeastern had a higher RPI than. 7 of those 8 teams, Northeastern was higher ranked in the RPI rankings. So I really do believe Mike Levin, Mike Sirota, Tyler McGregor, Alex Lane, and the rest of the Huskies, I think they deserve to get into the tournament. Could Northeastern have done a little bit more in the CAA tournament? For sure. The fact that Charleston lost in the finals, though, and didn't make it into the tournament after winning the regular season of the CAA, just shows that the committee did not value the CAA at all, and they'd rather have more SEC teams in. Which is obviously tough to see, but that's just the reality. The CAA doesn't get their way like the SEC does. The SEC typically gets their way. But Mike Levin and the Huskies had another great season. 35 wins. They have nothing to be ashamed of. Another 35-win season with 38 wins overall. This is the second year in a row that Northeastern had the Defensive Player of the Year in the CAA. Last year, it was Spencer Smith. This year, it's Luke Beckstein. Tyler McGregor won the CAA Co-Player of the Year. He entered the regular season leading the conference in batting average with a 405 batting average. Had 92 hits, which also led the CAA. Led the CAA in slugging with an 802 slugging percentage. With the best OPS, 1287. The most runs scored with 70. The most RBIs with 80. And the most doubles with 29. His 29 doubles in the regular season were the most by an NCAA Division I player this season. And he also had 92 hits, which was the 3rd most in college baseball. He also had the 12th highest batting average in the entire nation. 80 RBIs was tied for 6th in the NCAA. And he also holds the Northeastern record for most hits in a single season, most RBIs in a single season, most doubles in a single season, and the most total bases in a single season. So credit to McGregor on a great season. He was terrific to watch all season long. Alex Lane also had a great season. 80 runs batted in, 6th highest in the NCAA, tied with his teammate Tyler McGregor for the 6th most RBIs in all of college baseball. Mike Sirota finished the year on a high note as well, with 4 multi-hit games in his last 5 contests. 59 walks overall, the 5th most in the NCAA in the season, with 48 strikeouts. That's a pretty good strikeout to walk ratio. 48 strikeouts to 59 walks. That's excellent. He also averaged 1.16 walks per game, the 3rd most in college baseball. A very patient hitter at the plate, knows the strike zone so well, a legitimate 5-tool player, who's also a leader. 29 home runs in 3 years at Northeastern, with 111 RBIs, 324 for a batting average in his career at Northeastern, 457 on base percentage, 576 slugging percentage, a 1033 OPS, 48 total stolen bases, and 158 runs scored in 143 games played. What a career Mike Sirota had for the Huskies, and I'm thankful I was able to see him play in each of the last 3 seasons. I didn't get to go to as many games as I wanted to this past season, but I'm still proud of this team, and I'm proud of how much they fought. As for Mike Sirota, I'm thankful to have seen him play as much as I did over the last 3 years. Northeastern was lucky to have him, and I can't wait to see all of the big things he's going to do in the future. Also, one last thing I want to note, He holds the record for the most runs scored in a single season at Northeastern with 73 in 2023. So congrats to Mike Sirota on an excellent career at Northeastern, and I'm wishing him all of the best in the future in baseball. I'm sure he's going to do big things. So thank you guys for taking the time to listen to this. I do wish Northeastern made it into the tournament. Like I noted, I think the NCAA needs a little bit different of a way to choose teams that get into the tournament. I know that's what they use for March Madness, where they have chairmen that are either athletic directors at schools or the commissioners for certain conferences, and they choose the at-large bids, and they rank all teams 1 through 64. I know that's what they use in different tournaments. Like the same thing goes for the Frozen Four tournament. Even though it's basically based off the pairwise rankings, there still is a committee that does end up, saying where teams are going to go and in what region they're going to play in. But I do think they need a different format. And I do think, obviously, it's worked in March Madness. It's worked in the Frozen Four tournament. But I feel like with college baseball this year, with 4 teams that were on the bubble, Kansas State, Indiana, Coastal Carolina, Florida, all of them having athletic directors on the committee, where there's only 10 athletic directors, and they all end up making it into the tournament. And then there are some other teams that got regional hosts or were top 8 seeds with ADs on the committee. I do think the NCAA needs to look into that system a little bit. I do. And we'll see how things work out in the future. But anyways, that'll wrap up this episode. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen to this. As always, I appreciate it. I hope you guys have a good one. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Thank you.